A new decade of film brings along new changes. When considering Great Britain, I think of British film renaissance. This, of course, is blending the old and new style. Many directors in Great Britain had active lives in TV and live theater, which explains why most of them only released 3 to 4 films across the decade. Some of Britain's best work of the decade did not pull in a lot of money, but did win Oscars. Examples would be Chariots of Fire from 1981 and Gandhi from 1982. Sex was a frequent theme to those dirty Brits. Alan Clark, writer and director of Rita, Sue, and Bob Too, says, "I think the English are highly motivated sexually." The British cinema was divided into conservative and liberal. The conservative wing was dubbed Masterpiece Theatre, which was a school of filmmaking that had an upper-class humanism feel with emphasis on conservative values. James Ivory has been directing since the 1960s, found a large audience from Room with a View. He worked with Indian producer Ismail Merchant and German writer Ruth Paul Walla. Room with a View was a huge success, grossing in $50 million and receiving 8 Academy Award nominations. Most of their films were made for less than $3 million. Eventually, the liberal wing caught flight. This wing of cinema was known as the kitchen sink. Critics complained of it being coarse and nasty, containing every manner of ugliness. It spoke towards those living in harsh social conditions with mostly rough, raunchy humor. Bill Forsyth was a Scot. All of Bill Forsyth's movies took place in Scotland. His first movie, entitled That Sinking Feeling, coming out in 1979, was very crude due to extremely low budget. This is a tale of a group of men who pull off a heist of 100 stainless steel sinks. Bill Forsyth's movies were very low-keyed and featured kind of mundane comedy. Stephen Frears was one of the most critically admired new British filmmakers. Between 71 and 74, he made over 30 16mm movies for TV. His career really didn't kick off until he teamed up with Hanif Kureishi. His first movie was My Beautiful Laundrette. It was originally made for TV, but when released theatrically, it was a big hit. Their next major film came out in 1987, entitled Sammy and Rosie Get Laid. It was probably about Sammy and Rosie getting laid. As we take a look at international cinema in the 80s in Western Europe, we go to Spain. Pedro Almodovar. Pedro is often known as Spain's poet laureate. Pedro is not much of a storyteller. Most of his movies were fragments of comedic scenes that were loosely connected instead of actual strong narratives and storyline. Some of his works would include Dark Habits, which is a 1983 production. This is about a Catholic superior who runs a convent specialized in rehabilitating junkies, and she recruits sinners by shooting them up with heroin. Another comic thrill ride would be The Matador. This features a bullfighter who faints at the sight of blood. As we swim over to France, we discover Claude Lanzmann directed Shoah. Shoah is a 563-minute documentary about the Holocaust and the Nazi death camps and those related to them. The death camps, not the Nazis. Shoah is Hebrew for chaos and annihilation. Claude Berry directed Manon of the Spring in 1987 and Jean de Florette in 1986. Both were adaptations of a 1936 novel entitled Water of the Hills. Both films were considered the most successful French movies of the decade. As we dive over to West Germany, Germany came rowing along with Das Boot, translated as The Boat. This was directed by Wolfgang Petersen. During this era, Denmark brought along 2 Oscar-winning Best Foreign Language pictures, Babette's Feet and Pele the Conqueror, directed by Billy August. Soviet Union filmmakers were encouraged to make movies more accessible and commercial. After 1985, the Soviet film industry began restructuring, which brought artistic freedom. This brought a large release of priorly suppressed movies being as old as 20 years out into the open. Some examples from this category are Gleb Panfilov's Theme, which was originally made in 1979 but released in 1986. This contained criticism of moral and artistic bankruptcy of Soviet cultural establishment. Polish cinema connected strongly with politics. Filmmakers were brave and daring to speak out against the corrupt government. One Polish director was Anderzej Wajda, who constantly defied the official lies of government. He was a speaker of the Solidarity movement. He was very committed to the ideals of freedom. And now, the third world. There are many challenges with filmmaking, film generally being more expensive and more difficult to control. The third world had issues with language problems, where if one character spoke in a regional dialect that it wouldn't be understood outside of the area, so subtitles would be needed to dub the film. There was also political issues, of course. Censorship was a very common thing. Victor Anti, a Ghana filmmaker in Western Africa, says, "Scripts have to be agreed by the government in your country, which leads to self-censorship, which leads to stories that aren't interesting and therefore can't sell." The Hour of the Star was a 1985 Brazilian movie by Susana Amaral. This was her first movie, which was made in 4 weeks on a budget of $150,000. Surprisingly, she was a 52-year-old mother of 9. And over in Turkey, the Turkish filmmaker Yilmaz Güney was a fighter for women's rights. He served many years in Turkish prisons just for his political beliefs. During the 80s, Japan still continued to decline. Artistic standards were lowered. The infamous television and video lured all Asians alike away from the big screen. In 1960, there were records of 1 billion paid admissions, which by the 1980s drastically reduced to 150 million. Still, the plus side was that production costs were extremely low. The average Japanese film cost was around 2 million, as opposed to the United States' 20 million. Following World War II, many comedies were produced. Juzo Itami was the most promising filmmaker to emerge this decade. He was the son of the 1930 director Bansaku Itami. Tampopo was his biggest success.